Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of my review of every single licensed Zelda game. If you haven't watched part 1, I would definitely recommend checking that out. There'll be a link down in the description where you can click the eye. And in this video, we're going to be covering the following games. Timestamps for all of them down in the comments below. There's a lot of games that we got to cover here, so I don't want to waste much more time on this intro. Let's jump right into it. So we're kicking this off with a pretty unique game right out of the gate. We're covering BS The Legend of Zelda Map 1. This is a remake of the original Legend of Zelda game, but released for the broadcast Satellview, which is an accessory by the Japanese satellite company Saint Giga for the Super Nintendo. It's a pretty interesting story in and of itself, and you kind of need to know the backstory behind this to understand the game. So if you already know all about the Satellview, feel free to skip to here in the video, otherwise keep watching. In the early to mid 90s, Nintendo played it a bit fast and loose with their IPs, which is why we got things like the Nelsonic Game Watch or the Barcode Battler 2 game. This was yet another lucrative deal that they brokered in the same vein, but they had a little bit more involvement for this one. Nintendo purchased some shares in a traditional Japanese satellite radio company, and then they released the Satellview peripheral for the Japanese Super Nintendo, and this allowed you to download games from the service. Between 1995 and 1997, they released 4 different Zelda titles. These games were unique in that, with the exception of the last one, they could only be played at specific time slots, kind of like watching a traditional cable TV show. There was also a live announcer during the gameplay who would say things at specific times, notifying you that events had been triggered in the game. And instead of playing as Link, you actually got to use an avatar that you created when you signed up for the service. The setup to make this happen, though, was pretty complex, and it definitely wasn't a cheap option, which is probably why this never caught on with a wider audience. Now, I don't live in Japan, and even if I did, the company that they did this through shut down operations in the year 2000. However, a group of very dedicated fans have been able to release a version of these games that will play on a regular Super Nintendo and do not need the Satellview live service to be able to run. There's also a few features missing because of this, like cutscenes at the beginning and end of some of the games, as well as the live announcer. There's no legitimate way to play the original versions of these, so in this case, I'm going to take what I can get. Now, the first game that we're covering here, BS The Legend of Zelda Map 1, is based on the original game for the NES. The overworld map has been shrunken down, and the game has gotten a pretty substantial graphical overhaul. Most of the enemies and characters that you'll encounter have definitely gotten a glow up, and so have the environments. But I will say there are a few, like this dragon boss of the first dungeon, that end up looking just a bit weird. The sound as well is a big improvement over the original, but it still manages to maintain the feel of the original game. In this version, you do get 3 characters to choose from. You get a scrolling text on the title screen that explains the basic plot. You're then thrown into the game, and you're scripted to go and meet the old man and get your sword as soon as it boots up. After that, you're able to roam freely again, although you will quickly find out that the world has a bunch of barriers and roadblocks preventing you from reaching later areas. Control-wise, it also takes advantage of the extra buttons of the Super Nintendo controller, allowing you to actually use the shoulder buttons to swap between the items in your inventory while you're playing. It's a really nice quality of life improvement and helps avoid the Link's Awakening syndrome. Because the map is a lot smaller in this version, the world is a lot easier to navigate compared to the original. And they actually took a cue from A Link to the Past and marked the first few dungeons on your map for you. The dungeons themselves also have remixed layouts compared to the original game, and in general I found them pretty straightforward. There was a lot less bombing through random walls to get to where I actually needed to go, and on the occasion where I did need to do that, it was usually a lot more clear than it was in the original. The bosses you fight are all returning monsters as well, and the strategies that you use for those fights on the NES are still valid here. One of the things that the original Satellview version of this game had was that there was a live announcer who would say voice lines at certain parts in the game, which would trigger different events. Now, these events could be something as simple as making a fairy appear on screen, causing lightning to kill all of the enemies in your vicinity, or even giving you unlimited bombs. The actual live announcer has been removed, but the events are still in it, which is why there's a timer in the top right corner here. There are several limited events where something really important is missable, like a secret heart piece, and because the game doesn't notify you that this is happening, keeping track of this on your own is incredibly important. There's also no real pause function in this game as a result, because the timer never stops going even on your inventory screen. The weekly time system from the Satellview version is still in place. You're only able to play this game for an hour in a specific cable time slot for 4 consecutive weekends. The way that's accomplished here is that once the timer in the top hits 57 minutes, a new week starts and more things open up. You need the candle to burn through these bushes over here to be able to progress to dungeon 3 and 4, but you can only get this candle starting week 2. So having completed everything in week 1, I had to just sit around for a while and wait until week 2 started so that I could actually progress the game. Ending the week-long cycle triggers a small cutscene where everything goes black and white, and then you're booted to the menu screen. This is also the only way to actually save the game. Now, as someone who is relatively familiar with the original game on the NES, I blasted through all of the content available in each week in about 30 to 45 minutes. You also might notice that while clearing through these dungeons that the maps actually spell out a word, which is Saint Giga, the Satellview provider. It's just kind of a fun Easter egg. Now, after you beat the 8th dungeon and get the final Triforce piece, you need to return to the starting screen where you met the old man and wait for nighttime, after which you see a rare cutscene, and then you can go on and fight Ganon himself. The fight against Ganon was surprisingly easy compared to the original, like it was over in a matter of seconds. After rescuing Zelda, you reunite with the old man, and he tells you to finish up anything you have left to do in the game. But considering the nature of this title, I'm not really sure what that would be. I had about 10 minutes to spare here, so once again there was a lot of waiting around before the game actually ended. When it does, you get a nice little ending credit sequence along with some unique images of Link that I'd never seen before. So this game was surprisingly well made, and I definitely consider it an upgrade to the original Legend of Zelda. It manages to capture the feel of the original while also streamlining and updating a lot of things along the way. I had a surprisingly good time with it. My only real complaint is the mechanic where I had to wait for the timer to run down to be able to progress. But if you're playing this and you're not familiar with the original or you don't know where to go, having all that extra time is probably pretty helpful. With all of that in mind, this game actually manages to get an A rank from me. I find it an improvement on the original in almost every single way, and because of that, I enjoyed playing through it significantly more. That being said, if you have a lot of nostalgia for the original, that's probably going to be your preferred version, but even so, this one manages to stand on its own as a fun and unique experience. Hats off to the fans who meticulously recreated this. If you don't mind going off the beaten path a little bit when it comes to the Legend of Zelda series, this one is definitely worth your time. And now we're covering BS The Legend of Zelda Map 2, which is a direct sequel to the last game. And it's also important to note here that some reproduction cartridges, like the one that I have, will actually have both games on it. But they were released at different times and are considered separate games. I chose a girl character this time around so that it'd be easier to tell which game was which. So this has the exact same aesthetic, music, and overall vibe as Map 1 did. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to the second quest of the original NES Zelda, in that the dungeons have been moved around a bit and remixed, and the monsters are generally harder. I actually died several times playing Map 2, especially at the start, and in Map 1 I didn't die a single time. That being said, it's not a significantly harder game overall, it just poses a little bit more of a challenge when it comes to the combat. And this actually made me appreciate the extra time on the timer a little bit more, because it meant I didn't have to stress or rush while I completed things. Although, I still ended week 1 with all of the content finished and enough rupees to last me through the end of the game with 17 minutes still left on the timer. The overworld map itself has been changed around a bit in this game compared to the previous one. There's some new land formations and islands and different obstacles, although the southern portion of the map is very similar. They also no longer mark on your map where some of the dungeons are when you first start the game, which does force you to go out and explore a little bit more. Although on the final day, you do get indicators of where every dungeon is just in case you miss them. The remix layouts of the dungeons were fine, but they did feel a bit repetitive this time around. And I will say there was a lot more random walls to bomb through without any real indicators that you had to do that, which I didn't love. And I also saw repeating room layouts and enemy formations from Map 1 reused here a lot. Ganon also still doesn't have his own dungeon before you fight him, it's just a straight line from the old man's cave. Now, events are still scripted to happen at specific times, and you still have that timer to keep track of it. As far as I can tell, it seems to be the exact same events at the exact same times as they were in Map 1. For example, this heart piece appearing on the beach. While I do find the idea of timed events kind of cool, without the announcer telling you what's going on, it is a lot to manually keep track of. Having to wait around for the timer to run out still prevails in this version as well, as I would often have a lot of time left on the clock after I finished everything that could be accomplished that week. On week 2 and 3, I only had at most 10 minutes to kill before everything reset, and on day 4, I only had 4 or 5 minutes before I could actually fight Ganon after clearing the last dungeon. Speaking of, the fight against Ganon was still pretty easy, but it did take me a little bit longer than it did in Map 1. 1. After the fight ended, I still ended up with a solid 10 minutes to kill though before the credits rolled and the game recognized that I beat it. I do want to jump in and mention here as well that there are 2 other fan versions of the BS Zelda Map 1 and 2 games. These are called Map 3 and Map 4 respectively. For those versions, they actually go through and implement a bunch of quality of life changes. One good example is making it so that the timer will automatically jump ahead to the next week or event that you need, so that you don't have to wait around after you've completed everything. I wanted to experience these games as close to the original version as possible, which is why I played the original Map 1 and 2, but if that's not what you're after, you might enjoy Map 3 and 4 more. So all of that being said, this game was incredibly similar to Map 1, just with a few key locations moved around. Also, the Easter egg of the dungeon spelling a word out, that still happens here, but instead of St. Giga, this time it spells out Nintendo. Since it doesn't offer anything new or innovative that you wouldn't have seen in the first one, everything ended up very much feeling like you're just treading the exact same ground. And as a result, I'm going to give Map 2 a B rank, just like I did the original Zelda. If you're looking for more of the same, or if you just beat Map 1 a long time ago and want to try something with a hair more challenge, then this game might be for you. But everything that this game does, I had already gotten to experience, and generally speaking, I just felt like Map 1 was a lot more smoother to play through. Still, there is some fun to be had here, and if you enjoy the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, you should definitely give either Map 1 or Map 2 a try. Now we're covering the third BS Satellview Legend of Zelda game. This one is known as the Ancient Stone Tablets. Surprisingly, when I booted this game up, there is the opening cutscene from the original Satellview version. And while the cutscene isn't anything amazing, it's a bit low quality and mostly just dialogue over a static background, it was a fun surprise. Based on the previous 2 games, I was not expecting this. The Ancient Stone Tablets is set 6 years after the events of A Link to the Past. Link has already left Hyrule to go on his own journey and look for new adventures, and he has not been seen in a long time. One day, a mysterious person drops from the heavens into the land of Hyrule, and this is your player character. Zelda and the old man find you, and because monsters have returned to Hyrule, they conclude that you are the hero of light destined to fulfill a prophecy. Your character then wakes up and you're tasked with saving the land. So this game once again has a 4-week system just like BS Zelda Map 1 and 2. It was originally only playable at specific times on the satellite TV network. The way that they handle this for the Super Nintendo version though is a bit different this time around. Each week is individually selected from this menu screen that you get when starting up the game. Progress carries over week to week, however if you do miss out on any dungeons from the previous week, you'll find the entrances blocked by thieves in-game who won't let you in, but they will give you all the key items and weapons from the dungeons. Meaning that if you weren't able to complete everything the previous week, you aren't completely blocked from progressing. The current day or week you're on ends at 57 minutes on the timer, and then there's a brief cutscene to fill the remaining 3 minutes. My experience with the timer and the week system was a bit different in this one. Unlike BS Map 1 and 2, I never finished all of the content for the week with a ton of time left on the clock. Maybe at most I had to kill around 10 minutes, and not having to wait around for an extended period of time every week was very nice. The live announcer was also present in this game originally, and for this version, instead of completely omitting it, it has been turned into a text box at the bottom of your screen. It mainly comprises of characters in Hyrule talking back and forth, letting you know when special events are happening as well as when there isn't much time left in that specific week. This worked okay, but generally speaking, I didn't really have time to look down at the screen and read this while playing. The events that you get in game at certain times were very similar to the ones you got in the first 2 Satellview games. For example, infinite bombs or arrows or fairies appearing on screen. However, the time of day and the weather were also controlled a lot more frequently by these events. Overall, I found these timed events to be a lot less exciting and game-changing when you compare them to the events in Map 1 and 2. It was more of just something I had to keep in mind and watch out for, since the weather would actually prevent me from doing things like bombing walls in the overworld, and there were also some limited time events like being able to get the bottle or try out some of the minigames. A few of the scripted events were actually superior to the ones in BS Map 1 and 2 though. For example, this one where you can go and save Zelda from Octoroks. So you start off the game by receiving a bag full of items, and that serves as your inventory. You don't actually get a sword or shield at the start of the game, but you do get a good bee that will follow you around and kill enemies for you. The first dungeon is located in the same place as the first dungeon was in A Link to the Past, and you're probably noticing how much the overall map, locations, and aesthetic very much match A Link to the Past. However, most of the dungeon locations have been moved around, and the map has been condensed in a lot of areas, making it a lot more streamlined and compact. You also can't access the Dark World in this game except when doing the final boss fight. The controls and items that you use in this game are lifted straight out of A Link to the Past. That being said though, they do still all feel really good to use, and the puzzles take advantage of them in new and unique ways. Each week you can complete 2 dungeons for a total of 8, and then there's the final boss fight, which is its own location. The dungeons themselves were very reminiscent of A Link to the Past, but generally speaking they were a lot smaller and easier to complete. And the bosses as well seem to have been toned down in difficulty significantly. I imagine this was because of the time limit and the developers not wanting to put in extremely tough fights or overly long dungeons that would run down the clock. Each dungeon will reward you with a heart container and an ancient tablet for completing it, but the tablets themselves aren't very well defined, and none of the characters in the game actually seem to know what they do until the very end. And when Zelda deciphers them, pretty much all it does is give you the silver arrows. Because of that, the plot in this game felt very, very thin. Near the end of the final week, the announcers noticed that Ganon has reappeared in Hyrule, and then you set off to fight him. The fight against Ganon felt a lot easier than in A Link to the Past, and I came out the other side only having drunk 1 single potion. So when the time runs out on the final week, you'll get one of 2 endings. If you manage to beat Ganon in time, you'll get the good ending, where you return the Master Sword to its pedestal in the Lost Woods, and then you leave their world. However, if you didn't manage to defeat Ganon before the clock ran out, you'll get this other bad ending. This game is also pretty quick to play through, as is to be expected, and it does feel very similar to A Link to the Past if you've played that one. But I did feel like the overall difficulty was a bit too easy for me. The in-game events and timer mechanic didn't feel as well implemented as it did in the previous titles, and more like something that was just slapped on as an afterthought. With all of that in mind though, I would still give this game a high B rank. If you enjoyed A Link to the Past and want more of it, this is a fun extension of that story, but its somewhat lackluster presentation and lack of any new mechanics or ideas definitely makes it fall a little bit flat in comparison. And this is doubly so if you've played the other Satellview Zelda games before this one. Also, it's another game that's a bit complicated to actually play in the modern age, so I would say this one is definitely more for die-hard fans than casual enjoyers of the series. All that being said though, it does have some fairly cool ideas in it, and it's overall a pretty fun game to play through. So there is one more Zelda game that was released on the Satellview, however it's just a port of the Japanese version of A Link to the Past. There's no significant changes or differences from the original. For this one you do actually play as Link, not your Satellview avatar. It's also the only Satellview Zelda game where you could play it at any time. You didn't have to wait for a specific TV time slot. Anyways, just wanted to throw this out there real quick so you guys didn't think I forgot about it. Other than the brief footage you're seeing here, the reason it's not being featured is because it's just a near identical port to a game I've already covered on this list. Now we're going to cover the Legend of Zelda game that I'm probably the most familiar with out of any game on this list, Ocarina of Time. So I played this game a ton when I was a kid, and it's honestly the game that got me into the Legend of Zelda series. That being said, not that long ago I did try to play it on Nintendo Switch Online, and I didn't have a great time with it. I'm also going to go a little bit more in depth on this review because this game will appear 2 more times during this series. So the game starts you off in the Kokiri Forest, and after obtaining a fairy and some basic gear, you pretty much immediately jump into the first dungeon. We'll talk a little bit more about them later, but generally speaking, I find most of the dungeon layouts pretty straightforward and well designed. So after defeating the first boss, the Deku Tree who we were trying to save unexpectedly dies, and then you're off on your journey. This immediately sets a dark undertone for this game, and I think the game handles the darker aspects really well. You soon meet Zelda in the palace, and she explains that Ganon is evil, and the two of you hatch a plan to stop him. Ultimately, this has you go to Death Mountain and then Zora's Domain to collect sacred gemstones to open the door in the Temple of Time. Along the way, you're going to be using a variety of interesting items, some of which are staples of the Zelda franchise, and some of which are pretty new. All of them feel really useful. Every time I found a new item, I couldn't wait to try it out, and some of the most useful ones, like the boomerang, would open up new secrets and new areas that you could go back to. I also really like how integrated the music is into this game. So the core Legend of Zelda series has always had great music, but they really went above and beyond in this one and integrated it into the gameplay in a new and unique way. You'll learn a variety of songs that all have different functions, like talking to a character from far away, kind of like a telephone, summoning your horse to your side, or even changing the time of day, and there are events that happen based on the time of day, so this was very useful. Later on, you even get songs that warp you to different destinations, facilitating fast travel. And you also have to remember the notes to each song, which I thought was really interesting. It's not just a button you press, you actually have to play it. Now, after you get the spiritual stones and open up the Temple of Time, you get hit with the first plot twist in this game. Ganondorf was basically following you and waiting for you to do this so that he could step in and take advantage of it. He uses it as an opportunity to enter the Sacred Realm. There's then a time skip and you wake up 7 years later as if no time has passed. Shortly after this, the whole time jumping mechanic is introduced where you can go back and forth in time from your kid self to your adult self, and this is one of my favorite things in this game. And as adult Link, a lot of the items that you got as a kid no longer work, so you either have to go without or eventually find alternatives. And even the replacement items you find as adult Link all do different things than the ones did as kid Link. All in all, the different items, both as a kid and adult, really switched things up and made everything feel fresh. Combat in general in this game felt okay. You use what is the first iteration of the Z targeting, and it's not perfect, but it's there. The combat's not super advanced. Usually it's mostly just swordplay and blocking. Occasionally you can use items to stun monsters and stuff. Now that you're an adult, there's a bunch of different temples and mini dungeons that you're going to have to clear in order to rid Hyrule of Ganon's influence. These dungeons pretty much follow the standard Zelda formula of where there's a bunch of different puzzles, you'll get useful items in them, and then eventually it culminates with a boss battle. The boss battles are actually where I feel like the combat is the most varied in the entire game. Typically you'll have to use whatever item you found in the dungeon in a specific way in order to make the boss vulnerable so that you can beat it. This is also usually telegraphed to you pretty hard from different examples during the dungeon itself, so you never arrive at a boss and have no idea what to do. Temples and mini dungeons in this game all feel just about the right level of challenging and the right length, with my favorite being the Spirit Temple because you actually have to jump back in time and complete part of it as a child, then jump forward and complete the rest as an adult. My least favorite was probably the Fire Temple, just because I found the rooms huge and there's a lot of backtracking. The Water Temple would be a close second though, because it is pretty confusing and the layout is not well conveyed to you. That being said though, the Water Temple wasn't as bad as I remembered. So as I've mentioned, there's several parts in this game where you need to jump back in time to your kid self to solve a puzzle or affect something in the future. I really enjoyed this game mechanic and seeing how things you did in the past affected the present, and the best part of this game center around it. Another thing that I want to shout out that I think is done extremely well in this game is how different in tone things become when you hop through time. With the world Kid Link is in being very lighthearted and almost goofy, and Adult Link being very bleak and serious. It was a real shock to see characters from around Hyrule Castle have to relocate after it gets destroyed and suddenly pop up in Kakariko Village. I really like how actions in the past will influence things in the future, even if occasionally it does create a time paradox. It helped make everything in this world feel really cohesive and alive. The game actually has a bit of an ambiguous ending, which I really like. You'll need to clear the final dungeon, which is basically made up of a bunch of mini dungeons that test all of the different mechanics and skills that you've acquired throughout playing the game. After you stomp Ganon a few times, you rescue Zelda, and then Hyrule is saved. Kind of. I like that it isn't a cut and dry happy ending, and I will say that the ending cutscenes where you see different characters who miss their friends who are now gone does hit you right in the feels. This game was every bit as fun as I remembered it to be, even after all of these years. The controls did take a little bit of getting used to and are definitely one of the weaker aspects of the game, but if you're playing on the original hardware, they're fine-tuned to work really well with that controller. In terms of plot for a Zelda game, it's top-notch here, with the game managing to pull off not just one but two pretty impressive twists that definitely the first time I played it I did not see coming. I also like that there aren't a ton of collectibles, and while a few of the side quests and activities can be a little bit long or vague in what you have to do, they never overstayed their welcome, and there weren't so many that it felt overwhelming. Every single one rewards you with something that makes all of the work worth it, whether it's just a new item, a new bottle, or even the best sword in the game. So I debated pretty heavily on whether or not this game should actually be an A rank, because some things like the graphics and even the controls to some extent haven't aged the best. But at the end of the day, this game does still absolutely get an S rank from me. In terms of a Zelda game, it's almost as good as it gets, definitely for this era. The game itself is so good and has so many merits that it vastly outweighs any of the minor negative aspects. There are a few more versions of this game that are going to pop up later in the video, and I'm very curious to see how they've improved on this game, if at all. This is a really fun one, and I'm so glad that I played it again. Highly recommend. So now we're jumping back to a handheld console and covering the first re-release of Link's Awakening. And this time it's Link's Awakening DX on the Game Boy Color. This version of the game, in addition to being in full color, also includes a bunch of new content, and we're gonna get into all that here. So right off the bat, it's great to see this game fully realized in color. While this doesn't look quite as good as A Link to the Past to me, it's still really nice to see this world with a lot more detail. A lot of the different things that blended together because they were just a couple different shades of green will now actually pop out. The story is still the exact same as the original. You still wash up on the island after a shipwreck. You meet the different inhabitants and have to go on a quest to be able to leave the island. You're still clearing out various dungeons in order to get musical instruments, doing it all with a bunch of very iconic Zelda items, and fighting a bunch of different bosses. The goal here being to get every different musical instrument so that you can wake the windfish. On the topic of dungeons, one new addition to this game is the Color Dungeon, which is aptly named as all the different puzzles and even the final boss all focus on using color as a mechanic. While this is a bit gimmicky and obviously it's just there to show off the capabilities of the Game Boy Color, the dungeon is pretty short so it didn't overstay its welcome, and the reward you get for clearing it is legitimately useful. You get a new tunic which is a different color, and it can either increase the damage you do or decrease the damage you take. I chose the latter because on my first playthrough of this game, going in blind, I died a lot and I felt taking less damage would be a better option for me. One of the other new additions to this version of the game is this mouse-like character called the Photographer. If you interact with the right characters in the right locations, this mouse character will pop up and a photo will be snapped of that moment. You can then view all of these photographs at the photographer's house. And speaking of gimmicky, if you have a Game Boy printer, you can actually print them all out. And knowing me, you better believe I busted out that Game Boy printer immediately. This whole printing thing is silly, unnecessary, and I love that it's included. The small cutscenes that you get that culminate in a photograph being taken were a really good addition to this game. They fleshed out a lot of the characters to a degree that wasn't present in the original, and because of that, it ended up being one of my favorite parts of the game. A good example is that once you have Marin following you, you actually get to take several pictures back to back, and these are probably my favorite ones out of all of them in the game. I legitimately laughed when I saw how they gave Marin's dad the side eye when he forces his way between them for a picture in front of the statue. And something else that I really appreciated about this game that I didn't notice my first time playing through is that the various characters that you interact with can actually be found at a bunch of different places on the map depending on what's going on with the story. For example, both Marin and this broom lady will relocate to Animal Village for a while, or Terran goes off on his own several times throughout. This really helped the world feel lived in and like you're actually just a traveler passing through while all of these characters are out there living their lives. And even though the new cutscenes and interactions were relatively a small thing, like they didn't add that much overall time to the game, it really helped make this world feel lived in and make all the characters feel real. And because of that, it brought both the plot and the characters to another level. In fact, because I now had so much attachment to all of these different characters, by the time I got to the end of the game and had to wake the windfish, it made me legitimately feel a little sad. I knew that because of my actions, they were all gonna disappear entirely, and I had grown to really like a lot of these characters, even just the small bit characters that you find, like these kids in the village. This was not the same experience I had when I played through the original, where I was mainly just pumped to actually get to the final boss and beat the game. So all that being said, this game does still carry forward a lot of the same issues that the original had. There's still a lot of time spent in menu swapping items, and all of the item management can get pretty tedious. There's also still that extremely long trading sequence that doesn't make a whole lot of sense overall, where you have to get specific items to specific characters before eventually at the end finally getting something useful. I do still find it really weird that you help deliver this picture for this goat woman to her pen pal boyfriend, and it's a picture of Princess Peach, all to fool him into thinking that she looks like that. It's just kind of a weird moment. Something else that I didn't mention in the original review because I knew I'd be revisiting it in this one is that while the overall music for this game is really great, one thing that did get on my nerves is the music that plays when you get a power-up. It's pretty much just a 5 to 10 second loop, will still play when you're in your inventory or in some cutscenes, and you get tired of it really fast. I legitimately avoided these power-ups whenever possible, even though they double your attack power or reduce the damage you'll take by half, just so that I didn't have to listen to that music again. So in the end, while this version of the game does still carry forward most of the issues that the original had, it adds in enough new content in addition to the visual upgrade to make this clearly superior to the original. The plot hit a lot harder harder this time around, and the characters felt so much more fleshed out and realized. For that reason, Link's Awakening DX on the Game Boy Color gets an A rank. This version is definitely still worth playing, and it definitely ranks up there as one of the best Zelda games on a handheld, period. So now we're covering the direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, coming out just 2 years later, Majora's Mask on the N64. As a kid, I did not enjoy this game. I put maybe 3 or 4 hours into it total, wrote it off as not a good game, and moved on. So it will be very interesting to see how my opinion has changed, considering the last time I played it was probably about 20 years ago. The game starts off with young Link riding Epona through a forest, searching for Navi, who left after the events of the last game. You're ambushed by 2 fairies and Skull Kid, who steal your horse and your belongings, and then they curse you into the form of a Deku Scrub before running off. One of the fairies gets left behind and begrudgingly teams up with you. Shortly after, you meet the Happy Mask salesman from the previous game, who reveals that Skull Kid stole Majora's Mask from him, and that if you get it back for him, he'll help you transform back into your normal self. The first few hours of this game are entirely different than anything you experience in Ocarina, or pretty much any other Zelda for that matter, as you're trapped in the Deku Scrubbed form and your moveset is completely different and very limited. One of the first things that you discover is that Skull Kid has managed to make this terrifying moon come crashing down, and that there's only 3 days left before the world is going to end. After meeting a bunch of the townsfolk and getting a feel for the controls, you actually fight Skull Kid, regain your Ocarina, and use it to create a time loop, traveling back to the very first day you arrived in Termina. You trick the Happy Mask salesman into turning you back into your human self, and then you're tasked with preventing the apocalypse. So when you're finally back into your kid self, this game does feel a lot more fun to play. Gameplay and control-wise, this game feels very similar to Ocarina, with quite a few items from that game making a reappearance. One key item that is massively expanded on in this game, though, is the masks. They give you a variety of abilities, and some, like the Deku Scrub, Goron, or Zora masks, will actually completely transform you and give you an entirely new moveset. This is one of my favorite parts of the game overall. I love all the new gameplay mechanics and opportunities that come from this. Even though I do feel like only a small handful of the masks are particularly useful, one thing I do dislike though is the animation that plays when you put on one of the main masks. It can be quite disorienting and very annoying, especially in fights where you're taking it on and off repeatedly. The other new main game mechanic is the 3-day time loop. So before the 3 days are up and the world ends, you have to play the Song of Time to reset the loop and go back to the start of the first day. Doing this will save your game, and it's the main way of saving. You can't just save anytime you want like in Ocarina, but you also lose any non-key items like ammo, and also any events you've done, characters you've met. That's all been undone and reset. And because of that, there's a lot of small events that you're gonna have to redo multiple times depending on what you're trying to accomplish. A good example of that is that beating this boss here makes it spring around Goron Village, and there's various events that only happen during spring, some of which you can't complete until much later in the game. So because of that, you're gonna have to beat this boss multiple times in different time loops so you can make it spring again and do those events. Early on in the game, you also get this notebook that keeps track of all of the different characters in the world and their problems, known as the Bomber's Notebook. While this is a great way to track which characters you've interacted with and whose stories you've completed, the fact that what you've done gets completely erased every time you reset the 3-day cycle means that filling this out does kind of feel like a pointless task. Something that sets this game apart from pretty much any other Zelda game is that it's also extremely dark. Everything from the themes of the world ending to the aesthetic to all of the different characters coming to terms with their own mortality, it has a very unique vibe that's all its own. The moon itself is particularly terrifying to look at. They did a really good job with the design here. Oh, and if you do fail to reset time before the 3 days are up, there is a cutscene of the world ending. Another thing that I do find off-putting in this game is that a lot of the characters from Ocarina return here, except they aren't themselves. I feel like having an entirely new cast of characters would have helped this game overall, but I also know that cutting that corner is probably what allowed them to get the game out so fast. This game is also a lot more difficult than Ocarina. A lot of the monsters have been beefed up and need to be defeated in really specific ways. And if you take too much time trying to complete something like a dungeon and have to reset the cycle, you're forced to start all over from the start, which can be really frustrating. This game also seems to have a much larger focus on platforming, but the controls haven't really improved much. The Goron mask and rolling mechanic in general, I found really difficult to control, as well as swimming in your Zora form. There's also so many mini-games in Majora's Mask, dozens even, and while some are fun, a lot of them are definitely a chore. To reach the final confrontation with Skull Kid, you need to stop the moon from falling, and to do that, you need to clear the 4 main dungeons. The first 3 dungeons are themed after one of the specific races that you encounter: Deku Scrubs, Gorons, and Zoras. The final dungeon is kind of a combination of everything. Each dungeon has a few mini-bosses and then ends with a real boss fight, and then you get a cutscene where one of the Guardians of Termina agrees to help you if called upon. The dungeons themselves can be pretty confusing, but thankfully none of them are overly large, and since there's only 4, I mostly give them a pass. When you finally confront Skull Kid again, the 4 giants come to aid you and hold up the moon, and then you actually get to go onto the moon itself, and it gets creepy again. Regardless of what you were expecting, it probably wasn't this. If you've gotten every mask in the game, you're rewarded with a final mask called the Fierce Deity Mask. This makes the final fight a joke and is a very fitting reward for doing all of that work. Finally, you go and fight Majora, and after winning, all of the people across the land celebrate. You get a really nice farewell cutscene with the fairies, the happy mask salesman gets his mask back, and then fireworks from the carnival close it out. This game really shines when it comes to all of the different characters you meet throughout the journey and the stories that they have to tell. I also do really like the complex puzzle solving that comes into play in the different dungeons. The 3-day cycle is a cool gimmick, but the amount of side quests, minigames, and other events where you have to make sure that you're at exactly the right place at exactly the right time does all start to make some of this game feel like a chore. And the sheer amount of things to do at specific times that you have to keep track of can be pretty overwhelming. I was definitely ready for this game to be over several hours before I finally got to the end. That being said though, it was significantly better than I gave it credit for as a kid. For me, this game teeters on the line between an A and a B rank, but as an apology for all the hate that this game used to receive, I'm gonna bump it up to an A rank. Majora's Mask has a lot to offer, and if enjoyed on its own terms, there's a very fun game here. It's really important to go into it not expecting another Ocarina of Time and appreciate it for what it is. This game is a lot better than most people give it credit for, and it's definitely worth revisiting. Next up, we're covering Oracle of Ages on the Game Boy Color, a pretty unique game in the Zelda franchise that is often overlooked. Visually and mechanically, it harkens back a lot to Link's Awakening DX. However, this title manages to forge its own identity pretty quickly with some very unique mechanics and a much more ambitious plot. It is important to know that Oracle of Ages released alongside a companion game called Oracle of Seasons. Both of these games seem very similar on the surface, but have completely different plots and can be linked together using a password system that will carry over your achievements from one game to the other. So Oracle of Ages starts off with an opening cutscene of Link traveling to Hyrule Castle, where the Triforce then throws him into another land and he quickly meets Impa, Zelda's attendant, and goes with her to meet Nehru, the Oracle of Ages. Impa then reveals herself to actually be the sorceress Verin, and Verin then possesses Nehru in order to use her time-hopping abilities. Her meddling with the past causes the present to change, including several characters turning to stone as they're written out of history. The real Impa then awakens, gifts Link with a sword, and sets you off on your quest to undo Verin's meddling and return the land of Labrynna to how it was. You quickly come across the Meku tree, who gets deleted from existence before your very eyes. Link then travels 500 years into the past to try and save her, starting the first leg of your adventure. After saving the Meku tree, you learn that her memories have been taken away and sealed in the form of something called essences, which have been locked away in various dungeons throughout the land. Along your quest, you also run into Ralph, a friend of Nehru, who is also trying to save her. In the past, you learn that the queen of that age, named Ambi, is constructing a giant tower as a tribute to her long-lost partner, and is being urged to finish it by the possessed Nehru, although to what end is very unclear. I am a sucker for a good time travel story, and this one is done fairly well overall, all things considered. There's several points in the game where a city or town will be pretty messed up in the present, but your actions in the past will actually save it, completely changing how it looks. That being said though, there are times where the constant hopping back and forth in time will get a bit tedious, but to be fair, there are just as many places where it is used to great effect. A new key mechanic to the Oracle games is rings, all of which give you specific buffs or abilities when worn. You also get an animal companion in this game, and even though their use is relatively brief, you do get to choose which of the 3 you'd like to accompany you. And there are different parts of the world that change depending on which one you picked, which is pretty cool and definitely adds some variety. variety. I was pleasantly surprised to see the return of a lot of Legend of Zelda tropes and characters from previous titles, like Toilet Hand from Majora's Mask or even the Happy Mask Salesman. Just like Majora's Mask though, I found there are also way too many minigames, a bunch of which are required to move the plot forward. There's also gacha seeds which you plant in specific locations, which will then grow into a tree with a random piece of loot within, and a bunch of the rare rings can only be gotten by doing this. This is one of the most cryptic Legend of Zelda games I have ever played. I do not think I could have made it through a lot of the dungeons in a reasonable amount of time without having turned to a guide, and there is such a high degree of backtracking involved in all of them, as well as some really time-consuming puzzles, where if you mess up even once you have to start it all over again. Because of that, for the most part, I just did not enjoy the dungeons or the puzzles in this game. And outside of the dungeons, there's also several parts where the game slows down to an absolute crawl, like when you wash up on the shore of Tokay Island and have to spend a ton of time trading back and forth just to get your items back. On a more positive note though, I did enjoy most of the boss fights in this game. They all felt pretty solid and unique, and figuring out their mechanics was usually a fun challenge. Near the end of the game, you free Nehru from Varen's influence, but Varen then possesses Queen Ambi, who doubles her efforts to finish the Black Tower. After collecting all of the essences for the Maku tree and getting the Maku seed, Ralph reveals that he intends to kill Queen Ambi himself, although right after you find out that he's actually her descendant, meaning he would be wiped from the timeline if he succeeds. There's also a B-plot going on where a disguised character, later revealed to be Twin Rova, appears partway through the game and alludes that they've been pulling the strings all along. Ralph gets defeated, but you manage to pull Varen from Ambi's body and then defeat her, after which she tries to bring the entire tower crumbling down upon you. After another pretty intense fight, Varen is finally defeated, but she reveals that her true purpose was just to sow discord on behalf of Twin Rova, and despite being defeated, she was actually successful. The now freed Queen Ambi thanks Link, and his party then travels back to the present, but before the credits roll, Twin Rova appears yet again and reveals that everything went according to their plan and that the adventure is not truly over. After the credits, you get a special password that you can use to link this game to Oracle of Seasons by inputting it in that title. So despite really liking the overall style, aesthetic, characters, and even what they tried to do with the plot, a lot of the gameplay did fall pretty flat for me in this one, especially the puzzles. However, as I mentioned, one of the key features of this title is the linked game system, so I'll reserve final judgment for Oracle of Ages until I've actually done that, which means that right here is actually where we jump into the review of the other title, Oracle of Seasons. Now we're covering the sister game Oracle of Seasons, which takes place concurrently with Oracle of Ages. Despite the fact that I had the password from Oracle of Seasons and could have linked the games right from the get-go, I decided to start fresh to see what the experience would be like with a blank slate. Oracle of Seasons doesn't waste any time throwing you into the action, with a similar opening cutscene where Link gets thrown into a foreign land by the Triforce. This time Link wakes up in the land of Holodrum, and he is immediately found by Din, the titular Oracle of Seasons. Din is then almost immediately captured by an evil force named Onox, which causes the Temple of Seasons to lower into the earth and throws the seasons of the land into chaos, causing distress throughout the land and endangering the harvest, among other things. The start of this game feels very quick, but not in a bad way. You're basically thrown into the adventure immediately with virtually no downtime. You find this land's version of the Maku tree, who tasks you with collecting the 8 essences, same as in Oracle of Ages. Interestingly enough, you actually need to clear out the first dungeon without a weapon to get your sword, which reminded me a bit of the Ancient Stone Tablets Zelda game. The main mechanic that sets this game apart from Ages is that you're able to change the seasons of the land using the aforementioned Rod of Seasons. Initially, you can only change to one different season, but as you play through, you unlock the ability to swap between winter, summer, autumn, and spring. Although you do still have to hop onto a tree stump in specific locations to be able to do this. You can use this ability to great effect, for example, turning the season to winter so that you can walk over a frozen lake bed to reach somewhere that was previously inaccessible, or turning it to summer, causing vines to grow on the walls that you can now climb. I honestly like this mechanic a little bit more than the time hopping of Oracle of Ages, as it felt a little bit more unique, less intrusive, and better implemented overall. I also think the presentation of seasons is a little bit better than Ages, and the game moves at a much faster pace, which I also appreciated. You still have to go and clear out 8 dungeons to get the different essences and then do the final boss battle, which again has 2 forms, but there was significantly less downtime between each section, and I found the dungeons themselves a lot more manageable to work my way through. Oracle of Seasons has a much heavier focus on combat, with significantly harder bosses and enemies to be found throughout. While most of the bosses in this game were okay, I did find many of them to be a bit frustrating and less fun than the ones I found in Ages. This game also has a secondary sub-world that exists underneath the main overworld and is called Subrosia, and Subrosia actually has its own currency and characters that populate it, and it's where the Temple of Seasons sank to at the beginning of the game. I really liked the difference in visual style and tone when entering this underworld, and some of my favorite sections in the game took place down there. When you do reach the final dungeon, the seed of the Maku tree and the 8 essences break the barrier open, and then Twin Rova comes swooping in to tell you about their master plan, which again feels pretty shoehorned in. The final boss fight against Onox I found particularly annoying, especially his second form. Beating the game and rescuing Din rewards you with the credits and another quick cutscene of Twin Rova telling you that it isn't over yet, and then a password to carry your adventure over into Oracle of Ages. I put in the password I had already gotten from Oracle of Ages to link the two together, knowing that this would let me compare back to back just how differently the playthrough becomes. So Oracle of Seasons now starts off with a cutscene of Twin Rova explaining that even though Varen was defeated in Oracle of Ages, her part in the plan was successful. Link then once again wakes up in a strange world and is found by Din, but now the various members of her troupe, Din herself, and even the big bad Onox do reference the events of the previous game, which does help things feel more tied together. This time around though, you actually start off with your sword, streamlining things even more. I was able to transfer over my rings from the first playthrough of Ages into Seasons as well, thanks to yet another passcode, meaning I did start the game off with some useful additions in my arsenal. Characters throughout the world will now also tell you small passwords that you can redeem with other characters in your first playthrough of Oracle of Ages that is linked to this one. The password trading system between both games required a ton of note-taking and was honestly a chore, as you had to keep track of dozens of different passwords, and then also sometimes get a new ring password from the snake to transfer the rings back and forth between the two games. This entire password system is definitely a relic of the past. I do like that they tried something different here, but I don't think that they succeeded. So while the game does follow the same formula and basic plot as the first time around, there are a bunch of new cutscenes, like Princess Zelda actually coming to Holodrum and you needing to save her from the great Moblin who recognizes you from the previous game. Queen Ambi also now appears in Seasons, and she reveals that the pirate captain who you've interacted with several times throughout both games is actually the partner that she had been building the Black Tower for in Ages, which adds a nice resolution to that plot thread from the other game. One of the most sizable pieces of new content is the Heroes Dungeon, which is located where you would have originally gotten your sword in the first playthrough. While you can clear through certain parts of this dungeon as you go, to make it all the way to the end, you have to have cleared all of the other dungeons in the game and gotten their respective items. The dungeon itself isn't particularly difficult or complex, especially when compared to some of the dungeons you'll go through in Oracle of Ages, but it was a relatively fun challenge to work through and rewards you with yet another useful ring at the end. The ending of this game is also where you start to see some pretty significant changes once again, as when you reach Onox's castle, Twin Rova will appear and kidnap Princess Zelda, intending to sacrifice her to resurrect Ganon. After defeating Onox, he reiterates that he was just a pawn there to cause mayhem and assist Twin Rova with their plan. The oracles from both games come together to cheer you on, and then you appear at the true final dungeon of the game. There's a very brief set of puzzles, and then you fight Twin Rova, who tries to stall for time so that Zelda's body can be used to house the revived Ganon. Twin Rova has two forms, first as two witches flying around, and then as the two combined, and both forms were kind of annoying to fight. The defeated Twin Rova then uses their own body as a sacrifice to resurrect Ganon, and then you fight the Demon King himself. This fight was pretty reminiscent of the earlier Zelda titles, and I actually quite enjoyed figuring out his patterns and mechanics. After Ganon is defeated, Princess Zelda awakens, and you're then teleported back to the Maku tree, where Zelda declares you a true hero before a new credits sequence rolls. At the end of the credits, you get another password, which if input into either game will activate what's called the Heroes mode. So all in all, Oracle of Seasons was a pretty fun game, and I like that it moved along quite quickly, never losing momentum. I did enjoy the season-changing mechanic and how this was used to traverse the overworld. My biggest complaints with Oracle of Seasons lie within the password system itself, which I found very cumbersome, along with some frustrating boss fights and the fact that you have to have played through both games to get the true ending. So with all of that in mind, I would give Oracle of Seasons a high B rank. While it's far from a perfect game, it manages to be a pretty solid offering for a handheld Zelda, although keep in mind to get the most out of this, you will have to do multiple playthroughs. So with Oracle of Seasons covered, now let's jump back to Oracle of Ages. So coming back to this title, I linked my new playthrough of it to my very first playthrough of Oracle of Seasons using said password, which causes the game to start off with a very similar cutscene to what happened in Oracle of Seasons, with Twin Rova narrating, but this time talking about how Onox's sacrifice was not in vain and how they are very close to being able to summon Ganon with their Gerudo magic. Oracle of Ages then starts off pretty much the exact same as it did before it was linked, with the only main difference at the start being that Link gets both a sword and a shield from Impa before he goes on his quest. I then immediately linked my rings using yet another password and set off to find the Maku tree and collect the 8 essences once again. That same password linking system from Seasons is here in this game as well, and it's just as time consuming in this iteration in exactly the same way. The first real change that I noticed was Princess Zelda coming to Labrynna and then getting captured, much like in Seasons. The Heroes dungeon that you unlock in Oracle of Ages for doing a linked playthrough I did find a lot more challenging and time consuming than the one in Seasons, although I didn't particularly mind it overall, and again the reward that you get for completing it is a ring that's pretty useful. I came to the conclusion during this playthrough though that the ring system didn't really do much for me. The fact that you're only able to use the ability of one main ring at a time means that the massive amount of rings available in the game mostly go unused and are kind of worthless. Eventually you defeat Veron in both of her forms once again, and then everyone is returned to normal and unfrozen from time. Impa then rushes over and reveals that Zelda was captured by Twin Rova, who just like in Seasons intend to use her as a sacrifice to resurrect Ganon. The sages from both games once again cheer you on, and then the rest of the game plays out exactly the same as it did in Seasons, with you traversing a very easy final dungeon, fighting Twin Rova, and then ultimately defeating Ganon when he's resurrected. You're then teleported to this world's version of the Maku tree. Zelda expounds on how much she appreciates Link's efforts and gives him a kiss on the cheek. After the credits, you get another password you can use to play on hero mode, bringing all of your rings into essentially an unlinked game. So all in all, while I do like a lot of what Oracle of Ages tried to do, it definitely doesn't rank up there with my favorite Zelda titles. I did find a lot of the boss fights in this game fun, but the slog of getting to them through the different dungeons brought down the entire experience for me. With all of that in mind, it was still a relatively fun game to play, so I'd give this one a low B rank. While definitely an okay game in its own right, I do prefer Seasons for its faster gameplay and more memorable moments and characters. That being said, Oracle of Ages did try and do a lot of things you wouldn't usually see from a handheld game of this era, so you won't go wrong by giving this game a chance. Just keep in mind that to get the full experience, you will have to beat both games as well as dealing with the headache that is the confusing password system. Next up, we're covering Ocarina of Time Master Quest for the GameCube. This is similar in concept to the second quest for the original Legend of Zelda, but instead of being something that you unlock, it was released as a separate title. And like a lot of the more unusual and less heard of games on this list, there's a story behind this one. So after Ocarina of Time was completed, Miyamoto set about creating an enhanced version of the game for the soon-to-be released N64 disk drive. This is a relatively unknown accessory for the Nintendo 64 that was only officially released in Japan, and it sold very poorly. This second version of Ocarina of Time, dubbed Ura Zelda, went through development hell for several years. It seems to have originally been intended to be a pretty sizable overhaul, potentially including new quests, dungeons, characters, and more, but as time went on, the scope of the project was slowly reined in. Many developers left Ura Zelda to work on Majora's Mask instead, and Miyamoto himself was even shifted onto that project at some point to help meet its deadline. For many years, news of Ura Zelda was pretty quiet until eventually it was released alongside the original game on a special disc for the GameCube that you could only get by pre-ordering Wind Waker, and instead of Ura Zelda, it was now called Master Quest. Despite this original project having very high ambitions, what we ended up getting pretty much just amounts to a port of the original game with remixed dungeons and a higher difficulty. I had never actually played Master Quest before now, so I'm curious to see how this all comes together. The plot of Master Quest is the exact same as the original game on the Nintendo 64. Link, the boy without a fairy in the Kokiri forest, gets saddled with one and then is tasked to save the great Deku Tree who has been cursed with evil. Although he fails and the Deku Tree dies, he gets the spiritual stone of the forest and is sent on a quest to find Zelda. After he does, she tells him about the evil man that she doesn't trust, Ganondorf, and they hatch a plan to protect the world by collecting the other spiritual stones. Ganondorf manages to get the final laugh, as when Link opens the door to the Sacred Realm, he reveals that he was waiting for him to do just that and enters it himself. Link then then wakes up several years in the future after Ganon has taken over Hyrule, and he goes on a quest to find the sages of several different temples in order to overthrow him. Along the way, he hops back and forth through time in order to make different events happen. Eventually, he does find Zelda, who is captured by Ganondorf, and then after defeating him, Zelda and Link make their escape from the castle before confronting Ganon in his beast form. After slaying the beast, peace is restored to Hyrule, and then Link is transported back in time to his original timeline, and this actually sets up the first instance of multiple timelines in the Legend of Zelda series. So I'd hoped that the controls of this port would be a lot better than they were in the original N64 version, but sadly, even though it's on the GameCube, that's not quite the case. Most of your movement in the combat still feels more or less okay, but one downside is that because the controller does not have the same yellow C buttons that the N64 controller did, the items that you would normally map to those buttons are now triggered using the C stick, and the C stick just isn't anywhere near as precise as a button press. The thing I struggled with the most was actually playing the correct notes on the ocarina. Now you can also use the Y, Z, and X buttons on the GameCube controller instead of the C stick, but it's not labeled on your UI as such, so it can get a little bit confusing, and you're still missing a button for the ocarina, so that doesn't really work. I also found the Z targeting in this version of the game extremely fickle. Often I would be facing an enemy and pressing in the trigger like you're supposed to, but it would just refuse to target them. Another thing that's seen a bit of a downgrade is that saving and even entering the main menu now take a noticeably longer time. This made me a little bit reticent to actually save the game frequently because it really started to break up the flow whenever I would do it. The main new feature of Master Quest compared to the original is that there are remixed dungeons. The dungeons themselves are still located in the exact same places in the overworld. However, the rooms inside have been jumbled around and redesigned. You're also going to be fighting much tougher enemies right from the get-go. The new puzzles and layouts that they presented were fine, but nothing that really stood out over the original. And in fact, a lot of these dungeon designs felt kind of obtuse and counterintuitive, especially whenever they repurposed existing rooms with new puzzles. And playing through these modified dungeon designs really made me appreciate how well the designs were in the original game to begin with. I honestly can't think of a single dungeon where I preferred the Master Quest version. A lot of the puzzles in the Spirit Temple or in Ganon's castle in particular felt very poorly designed, and these caused the most frustration. Also, a ton of the puzzles in this game now involve moving around blocks using the Song of Time, and when you have to do this, it slows down everything to a crawl. All of the dungeons in this game get this kind of remix, from the starting 3 to the temples to even the side dungeons like the Ice Cavern. At the end of the day, you're still playing Ocarina of Time, which is a top tier game, but with a lot of weird choices and modifications that bring down the overall experience. All of the content that carries forward unchanged from the original game, like the plot, the overworld content, and the side quests, still resonate just as strongly as they did in the N64 version. The original game I considered an S rank, although it was a little bit borderline since I felt that the controls and the graphics hadn't aged the best. This version though suffers from even worse controls, and a huge part of the gameplay has been made objectively worse. And because of that, it knocks it all the way down to a B rank for me. While this can be an interesting diversion for fans of the original game, if you've never played Ocarina of Time before, this is definitely not the recommended version to start with. Master Quest had a lot of potential to be a lot more, but what we ended up getting was just a less fun version of a classic. So now we're going to cover the first multiplayer game ever released in the Zelda franchise, Four Swords on the Game Boy Advance. So this came packaged on the same cartridge as the Game Boy port of A Link to the Past, which I'm also going to be covering right after this one, but I'm doing this one first because completing this game actually unlocks an extra dungeon in A Link to the Past. So the game starts with a pretty brief cutscene of Zelda and Link visiting a mysterious sword. This time though, it's not the Master Sword, it's the Four Sword. Zelda gets abducted by the big boss of the game, Vati, and you decide to go save her, grabbing the sword to help. When you grab the sword, you split into multiple different links, and you can have up to 4. And this is the in-game justification for why you can have up to 4-player multiplayer. In this playthrough, I just played it with one friend because 4 people felt way too chaotic. After that cutscene, you need to go through the effort of connecting to another Game Boy Advance. Because this version of the game is multiplayer only, there is no single-player campaign. Getting the game to connect and have a stable connection to another Game Boy Advance was probably one of the worst parts of this experience. Recognizing the other device could take a while, and if the link cable ever got wiggled even just a tiny little bit, you'd get this disconnect screen and the level you're in would end and you'd be booted back to the start menu where you have to reconnect. So at the beginning, there's only 3 main stages in this game plus a tutorial. The main stages are all broken up into 3 sub-stages, and after you clear those 3, a 4th final boss dungeon opens up. The premise of these stages is pretty simple. The goal is just to make it to the end with as many rupees as you can. At the end of each stage, you're ranked based on how many rupees you collected. Although ultimately, it doesn't matter who wins, it's just for bragging rights. There's also a heart piece at the end of each stage, and you get to decide which player actually gets that. It also tells you in-game how long it took to complete each stage, meaning this game probably has speedrunning potential. Now, there are a few different things that this game does that really make it stand out and feel unique. The first is that all of the different levels are actually randomly generated. If you ever exit a stage and come back, it's going to be completely different. There's going to be different items, different layouts, even different enemies. Because of that though, there's definitely some stages that have very strange layouts and not in a good way. The next thing that makes this game feel different than most other Zelda games is that other than your sword, you can only carry one item at a time. Anytime you find a new item out in the wild, you have to swap it with whatever item you're currently carrying. This took a lot of getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, you're fine. They'll always give you an item right before you actually need to use it, meaning you're never left searching for an item and then doubling back. Most of the items that you're going to get are staples of the Zelda franchise, like a bow and arrow, bombs, or even a boomerang, but the standout item in this game was actually a totally new item, the Nat Hat. This shrinks you down so that you can go through tiny little holes in the wall and get to new areas. This is a precursor to what would eventually be done in the Minish Cap a few years later. The other thing that makes this game really feel unique is how the puzzles are designed to take advantage of having multiple people. There's a lot of different obstacles where you have to work together, either to push down switches at the same time, throw each other across gaps, lift big boulders together, and more. It added a different kind of depth to the gameplay that has never really been in a Zelda title before, and I really like how it forces you to work together. So the gameplay itself feels very similar to A Link to the Past, or even more so Link's Awakening, and having played that game before this one, most of the strategies I learned there did apply here. A lot of the same enemies will appear here and you defeat them the same way. It's quite similar. The game itself moves really quick, with some levels only taking a handful of minutes to complete. The bosses themselves were a bit uneven and were one of my least favorite parts of this game. The hardest part of the fight was pretty much just figuring out what you actually had to do to damage the boss. Once you actually figured that out, which could take a while, the fight was usually over in a matter of seconds. The final boss was a fun challenge though, as he mirrors different aspects and abilities of all of the previous bosses. And that's actually where this review would have ended had I not also completed the anniversary edition of this game about a month later and found out a few things as a result. You don't get the quote-unquote true ending until you actually beat this game 3 times. And if you're wondering why I didn't realize this at the time, it's because it's never actually communicated to you in-game. So you need to clear all of the stages again twice. And the first time you do so, you need to end with 3,000 rupees, which is still totally doable in a normal playthrough. The boss fights are a little bit different, but you still get basically the same final dungeon and the same ending. The third time you play through it, you're actually going to need to end with 5,000 rupees. The trick that we discovered is that if both players are at full health, you actually activate a mode called Rupee Fever, and all of the rupees in the stage are now worth double. So what you actually want to do is avoid picking up any rupees until you have this mode active, and then go crazy trying to get as many rupees as possible before somebody takes damage. On this third playthrough, the bosses are even harder, but this actually just kind of made it a fun challenge. When you go back to the final stage and unlock the third door, the final dungeon is now completely different, featuring various courses from the other 3 stages as well as their bosses, before culminating in a final battle against Vati once again. As far as I can tell though, the actual ending cutscene isn't any different, or at least it didn't seem so to me. Also, while playing through these stages again, the connection issues that I mentioned before were more of a problem than ever. And while eventually we did find the right combination of Game Boys and link cables to be able to do it without dropping that often, it was an ever-present possibility always looming over our heads. Another thing that I hadn't realized is that there's also 2 abilities that you unlock in 4 Swords by playing A Link to the Past. The first is the Master Sword, which you'll actually get pretty early in that game, and it lets you shoot a beam of energy while attacking if you have full health. The second ability is the Super Spin Attack, this kind of tornado move, which is a lot less useful than it sounds. It's pretty much only good for mowing down large patches of grass, and for me at least, I unlocked it pretty late in the game, so it didn't get a whole lot of use. While both of these abilities are cool, neither of them are really necessary to beat this game. So while there is more game after having discovered this, the stages were still randomized versions of the same thing, making it feel more like padding than anything. And the fact that you didn't get a super cool secret cutscene for beating all of them felt a little bit underwhelming. With all of this in mind, the game does still get a B rank. It's fun, and it's a nice multiplayer diversion from the main Zelda series, but it definitely didn't quite reach the full potential of what a multiplayer Zelda title could actually be. And that about wraps it up for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at 10 more Zelda games. Most of these games were unknown to me, so I had a really good time playing through them. The next video in this series covering the next 10 Zelda games will be out pretty soon, so definitely look forward to that. And eventually at the end, I might do a video where every single game is reviewed as a marathon. Anyways though, I very much appreciate your time. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I'll catch you in the next one.